Hello and welcome, dear listener. Yes, the Iron Fist and the Velvet Glove podcast, episode 433, coming to you on the 24th of June, 2024. I'm Trevor, aka the Iron Fist. With me, as always, Joe, the tech guy. How are you, Joe?
Evening, all.
Yes, we don't have Scott. Scott is working hard this evening, so keeping those private school accounts in order. No doubt making sure that every government dollar is extracted as much as possible. I think that's what he's up to. Anyway, Scott, good morning to you as you're listening to us on your morning walk, which will effectively be tomorrow. Well, dear listener, I reckon we'll probably just do an episode on Peter Dutton's nuclear, now I don't want to say policy.
Folly.
Thought bubble. It is an exaggeration to call this a policy, and the ruckus that it's caused. And let's just talk about it. And it's so instructive of where our politics is at, where our population is at in its ability to understand topics and its tribalism. And, you know, it's really going to be a good examination of our capacity as a community to call out bullshit when we see it, call out obvious crap. And if we can't do that on what is a really simple decision, then Lord help us, Joe. Maybe not the best expression.
We saw this in 2016 with Trump, didn't we?
Yeah, what are you thinking exactly there?
The more egregious the lie, the more the press were falling over themselves to repeat it.
Yes, yeah. So let's get something straight right from the get-go with nuclear energy. Joe and I were just talking about this prior to going live. In certain countries, it may well be a very good decision to fire up and create nuclear reactors. Like, it may make perfect sense if you don't have the ability to use wind turbines and solar energy, and you don't have access to those things. And your other peculiar circumstances of industry or other requirements might make it a sensible thing, but not here.
I think 60 years ago, maybe that was the case. I don't even think in Europe these days it is.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not against nuclear power in that sense. Like, I'm completely agnostic about it in the sense I don't have particular fears about danger.
I grew up in the shadow of a nuclear power station.
Yep. I don't have particular fears about the waste storage, particularly in Australia with fairly stable, we don't have earthquakes and whatnot. It's just the economics of it. It's so obvious that our economics means that it doesn't make sense. And that's the incredible part about all this. We'll see where we get to. You about to say something else then or not?
Oh, I was just... there was something about one of the power stations, because they're talking about converting some of the coal-fired stations sites, of the 7 that have been picked, and one of them, it was mentioned, was actually in Australia's highest area of earthquakes.
Oh, was it? Okay.
So it wasn't a particularly good choice, but I think it's still relatively low compared to Japan, which does have nuclear, and despite Fukushima, the actual impact to the population has been relatively little, given that they've been running nuclear power plants for, 60, 70 years?
Yeah. Yeah. So it's an amazing sort of case study that we can use on the state of Australian politics looking at this whole issue. So before we get on to that, Joe, just a quick bit of homework. I did a video last week about Joe Biden and the parachutists and how he sort of wandered off to the side and
to talk to a guy who was backing up his chute.
Yes,
which was in the video that you showed.
Kind of. The
Yeah.
video was kind of. There are videos going around that are kind of clipped, and
Right.
so the spokespeople for Biden are saying that these videos have been altered and they're cheap fakes, and that there was a perfectly good explanation for him for the way he wandered off from the crowd. And what did you think? It's still an odd behaviour.
He does look like a dazed old man when he's guided back.
Yes.
I don't think it was quite as bad as was made out by the right-wing press,
Yes.
but I think they're both in their dotage.
Yes. So some of the videos, I'm not sure the one I showed, whether it showed the guy. It did show the guy packing his parachute. It was certainly odd behaviour, and there are some videos which are edited in that they cut off some of the vision. But in any event, I think Joe is sliding into a type of dementia that doesn't look particularly good. So anyway, just mention that as an aside, as a bit of homework. Thanks for Matic Man. I think you pointed that out.
He wouldn't be the first president to die in office.
How many have died in office?
FDR at the very least. I think there've been, what's his name? Lincoln was assassinated.
Yes. Kennedy was assassinated. Yeah.
I think there's another one that was assassinated, wasn't there?
Don't know. But
Further back in time.
yeah. Certainly Reagan was in a dementia-type state towards the end and was relying on cue cards and things like that, and was just being shuffled along as an old man. So,
He was an actor. He was used to it.
yeah. Alison's in the chat room. Hello, Alison. And Landon Hardbottom is there, and John Simmons as well. So good on you, folks. Right, let's talk about this whole Dutton and his nuclear thought bubble. Joe, I've been listening to different arguments as people mount them on left-wing or even neutral sort of sites, thinking ABC here, thinking Labor Party members as they're talking about it. One of the things that came up was that sort of initially Labor was concentrating on the dangers of nuclear, and there were memes being passed around showing mutations of people and things like that. And that just made it easy for the pro-Dutton camp to say, stupid Labor, raising unnecessary fear-mongering, this is a safe technology.
Yeah,
It was an arg of all the things you could complain about with his policy, that was way down the list. And I watched the 7:30 report, 2 episodes where they were sort of dealing with this topic, and basically in the 2 episodes on the 7:30 report on ABC, there was no mention of the levelised cost of energy report showing that nuclear is expensive in Australia compared to the other
that would
options.
be too useful.
Exactly. What we got was old men living in the electorates where there's currently coal-fired stations that would be the likely spots for nuclear power stations, and this would create jobs in their community.
You do know what generates large levels of radiation in the community, don't you?
What's
Coal-fired
that?
power stations.
Yeah, right. No, I didn't, but it doesn't surprise me. Right?
Yeah,
Coal emits radiation?
Coal has small amounts of radiation in it, and as you burn it off, the small specks of radioactive dust go up the chimney and fall out in the surrounding area.
Right.
So there are actually higher levels of radiation around a coal-fired power station than there are outside a nuclear power station.
Well, all these 7:30 reports didn't care, Joe. They just went to these, they're really rural areas, I guess, and found old men and said, what do you reckon? Would you be happy with a nuclear power site here? And guys with only a decade or 2 left in their lifespans,
Didn't give a
still
damn.
running businesses, were going, yeah, I'd be happy to have one here. And because, Joe, because they wanted the jobs, they wanted the economy, they wanted the infrastructure, the spending, they wanted people to stay in their community, and they had no idea of the relative cost of nuclear versus renewables.
If
And
it was the right technology, I wouldn't have a problem with nuclear.
yeah,
The problem is it's not the right technology.
yeah. But these guys were seeing it from the point of view of, well, our community could use some jobs, and if this is offering jobs, then great. They were totally without any knowledge of the merits in terms of the cost compared to other.
I do think that's been the other problem is we haven't offered a viable answer for the communities that are going to be hit by the shutting down of coal mining.
Yes.
We haven't said, here is our plan for the future. This is how we move to renewables. These are the jobs we're going to create. This is how we're going to take your expertise and leverage it.
Yeah. Like maybe construct solar farms, wind farms, the water dams that are required, the lower dam, the upper dam for the sort of the storage.
Hydro.
Yeah, the pumped hydro. These sorts of things could be done maybe in those areas if they're suitable. But you know what? If the areas just aren't suitable for that, then they're just not suitable. If it's flat, if it's not windy, maybe it's just not suitable. And you have to move. Like sometimes people just have to move. It happens everywhere.
Yeah.
But
there are other things. We can look at green hydrogen.
Yes. Yeah. True.
So we can be a major source of green hydrogen that we can sell to the rest of the world.
Yep.
And we can also grow biodiesel.
Yep. It may not happen in those electorates. It might have to be in other electorates for other reasons. But certainly overall, that's the possibilities.
But I think regional areas don't necessarily, even if it's not the same regional, it's not that everyone's going to be forced into the cities or whatever.
Yes. A lot of that stuff, you're right, could definitely be in the regions.
Mm-hmm.
But, Joe, just cost money. Like when it comes to elections, the famous Clinton line was, it's the economy, stupid. Well, when it comes to a range of energy sources, the fact that the renewables are so much cheaper than nuclear should have been the first, second, third, and last thing that every advocate should have said to these people, because the people who are against this, Joe, money's usually their main motivation.
Yeah, but again, we come to the fact that renewables aren't 24-hour a day. And I don't think it's been explained adequately to the public how we can have a solely renewable system that can cope 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 a year.
Yeah.
And I think that's the big missing piece is people are going, but what about my base load?
Yeah.
And I have seen people talking very, very persuasively about that.
Yes.
The problem is these conversations are not being held in front of the average citizen.
Exactly. We've talked about it here. We've gone through it and talked about pumped hydro and various reports that are available that make it perfectly feasible. And it's a great system. And that sort of information, if you tell it to people, their eyes just pop out of their heads and go, I talk to people, old boomers around here and say, you realise, of course, that renewables are so much cheaper than nuclear. And they have no idea. Nobody's ever, from the information sources they have no idea.
And also, they're taking their experiences. I mean, obviously, Australia is an incredibly sunny country, but we get an average of 8 hours of sun a day in Brisbane, but that's only a third of the day.
Yes.
But what people don't realise is between Tasmania and the mainland are the Roaring Forties, where the wind is so consistent that sailors before the age of steam regularly moved around the world using the wind.
Yeah.
You could run wind there for probably 60-70% of the time. So the wind is going to blow in some part of Australia most of the time.
Yes. Yep. So I'm going to talk later about an article in the Sydney Morning Herald where Peter Fitzsimmons was interviewing an energy expert about this. But he made a really interesting point about wind power, and I'm just going to try and find it here now if I can quickly find it, about how much is generated by these offshore wind farms. So, yeah, the latest turbines tend to be offshore, and the biggest of them are 15 megawatts in size, which provides 150 times more power than the first ones that they had. Just one turbine could power a town with a population of 5,000 homes. It's incredible, isn't it? And he says here, a single rotation of the blades of a large wind turbine generates the same power as the solar panels on 5 homes would export in an entire day. These things are huge, and their capacity to generate energy is massive. They're offshore. They're out of the way. Mm-hmm. They're a really good solution. Wind blows at night time. They're an amazing solution in conjunction with all, photovoltaic solar and the storage that we've mentioned before.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, when I was back in France at Christmas, I was up at a cliff on the northern part of France, and they've just opened up a brand new wind farm out there that's 496 megawatts.
Yeah.
So that's about the same size as a standard power station. The
Right.
biggest power station, I think, here is just over a gigawatt.
Yep.
And this was half.
Wow. Yep. Yeah. They're quite extraordinary what's possible.
Mm.
The other thing about this, Joe, that just amazes me that right-wingers, Liberal Party rusted-ons are all for the nuclear because that's what their tribe's for, or their tribe leader has declared. And it goes against the fundamentals of what they normally go for. So it's fully acknowledged by Dutton that if this nuclear power, I don't want to call it policy, this thought bubble, requires the government to do it. It's not private enterprise. It's going to be a big government bureaucratic operation. And the people in favour of this are normally so pro-free enterprise. The market, free enterprise. You can't have government doing stuff because the government's always wasting money. You don't want large bureaucracy. And on this issue, those sort of fundamental liberal values are just thrown away, and all of a sudden they're happy to have a big government bureaucratic monster created, building infrastructure that is notoriously built over time and over budget. It's so counter to what they would normally want.
Well, no, they want government funds going to private industry.
Yeah. Oh, yes, of course. So this is government funds going to government industry. Yeah.
Well, no. So you spin off a private company that's going to have shareholders.
Yes.
And it's going to be run by Peter Dutton's mates.
Of course. It'll be sold off, privatised.
Yeah, absolutely.
Government will build it and then it'll be privatised.
Yeah.
In the meantime, though, just the fundamentals, when they're looking for solutions for things, they always talk about the market and free enterprise. And we've got heaps of free enterprise groups wanting to build renewable sort of options. Yeah. Actually, I think it was, who was it? Monique Ryan said, if only we lived in a country with lots of sparsely populated land, year-round sunshine, endless windy coastlines, established solar, hydro and wind industries, and billions of dollars of private investment lined up and ready to go. If only we had that.
They've been lined up for a long time, but because of every time the LNP get into power, they screw up whatever renewable incentives are out there. They're just unwilling to invest because they don't know what the next LNP government's going to do.
Yeah.
40 years ago, we could have had a booming renewable sector.
Yep.
But there's too much money floating around in certain other industries.
Yeah. In Crikey, some letters to the editor, I think, summed it up. There was a guy, Terry O'Hanlon, wrote, "All Peter Dutton cares about is appearing to offer an alternative. He doesn't care if it's unrealistic or if there are federal and state laws in place that'll make it impractical or even impossible. It's likely better for him that way, as he can more easily abandon his nuclear folly after he wins the election. He wants simply to be proposing an alternative something so he can give the electorate a justification for kicking the current mob out." There's a lot of truth in that. The headache of actually getting this done is not something that Peter Dutton thinks he's going to have to deal with.
No, and I don't think it was. It's also an excuse not to stop burning coal.
Yes.
Which realistically is what the LNP and the Murdoch press is all about.
Indeed.
So even as the coal-fired power stations break down, which they are, they're reaching their end of their design lives, they want to move to coal seam gas. They don't want renewables.
Yeah. That is part of it. Another guy, Bill Barnes, wrote, "Dutton and his strategists have appeared to borrow straight from the Steve Bannon playbook to flood the zone with shit, announce something highly controversial with little detail, and sit back and watch the media and other commentators fall over themselves in reporting on nothing." That's true too.
Trump 2016.
Yep, indeed. Just announce shit and step back. And there's no accountability, there's no shame in the world anymore, Joe. So this is why people can get away with this. Jack the Insider on Twitter said, $500 billion energy policy announced with a 20-minute press conference and a one-page press release. He said, "I've seen Nigerian email scams with more detail." Dead right.
And probably more realistic.
Indeed. More believable.
Well, yeah.
With the assistance, Joe, of News Corp, who are actively promoting the nuclear idea,
Oh, yeah.
and the ABC, who are inadvertently promoting it, I think Dutton might pull this off, as in win over voters enough.
I'm sure.
As in, it's depressing, isn't it? I think he might pull it off.
And also it gives them an excuse to get out of Paris, because we can't possibly meet Paris in the short term.
Yes.
So we're going to go completely zero emissions by going nuclear, whilst ignoring that electricity generation isn't all of our carbon emissions.
I'm going to give some examples of News Corp and the ABC and how they've handled this whole issue. One guy, Dean Rosario, again on Twitter, said, "Peter Dutton could claim the earth is flat and the ignoramuses at ABC News would report that as news. Spears and Cavalis would ask Albo, Peter Dutton says earth is flat. What's your response to that?" It's dead right. They don't stop and say, hang on a minute, that's complete nonsense. Have you gone crazy? I'm not going to put that to anybody else. You've got to justify this before we start getting other people's opinions on this. It's completely bonkers. Nope. Don't get any of that.
I think Albanese should just announce a perpetual motion machine that's going to generate lots of energy for nothing.
Yeah.
And give as much detail as Mr. Dutton has.
Yeah.
So it'll be even cheaper because, it's a perpetual motion machine.
Yes. So
I agree with Alison. It's a scam to protect fossil fuels.
yes. Yeah. Yeah. John says this is not a policy that will get the teal seats back.
We can only
that's
hope.
true. That's true. That will not. Sue says people complain about wind farms next to them as well. It is a big deal in Port Stephens at the moment. Yes, people do complain about the wind farms. I wonder how much they'll complain about nuclear facilities. And that's why I think the wind farms that are 20 kilometres out to sea are such a great option. I mean, realistically.
Yeah, but then
You can't
of course
complain
they
about-
interfere with the right whale migrations.
Yeah. I think whales have been navigating shipping, islands, other hazards.
Yeah.
I reckon they'll find their way around a wind farm without too much trouble. Okay, what else have I got here? So legal hurdles, Joe. This is the interesting part. Michael Bradley, writing in Crikey, talked about some of the legal hurdles, and the fact is that the premiers of the states where the reactors will supposedly be built have already said they don't want them and they won't be changing the law to allow them. And each of the states has specific legislation prohibiting the sort of activities you need to build a nuclear power plant, like constructing and operating a nuclear facility, transporting nuclear material or waste, and converting or enriching uranium. It's all banned at a state level.
New South Wales doesn't.
Doesn't have some of that?
Well, but there's what's it, isn't there? The
Lucas
research
Heights.
reactor. Yes,
I would imagine it has a special exemption to a broad prohibition.
probably.
That's what I think would probably be the case here. So Dutton needs the states to repeal the laws that are already in place, or he somehow needs to override it with valid Commonwealth legislation. So neither of those is possible. But even before we get to that, there's federal law against it. So there's existing federal law which expressly prohibits an environment minister from approving the construction or operation of a nuclear fuel fabrication plants, nuclear power plants, enrichment plants. In addition, there's the Australian Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety Act, which prohibits the nuclear regulator from authorising the same activities. So at a federal level, the law is against it. He would have to get control of the House of Reps and the Senate in order to change that law. That's never going to happen. The last time the Liberals had control of the Senate and the House of Reps was John Howard, and ironically used that power to legislate the federal ban on nuclear power, Joe. I love the irony of that. So at a federal
They
level...
had, Ziggy Swiatowski for a while, didn't they?
What about him?
Well, he's actually a nuclear physicist.
Yes.
And they had him, 10, 15 years ago, investigating the possibility of nuclear. I don't know what the output of that ever was, but they were in power at the time. They could have done it then.
Yeah, they've been in power for, 10 years with Turnbull, Morrison, etc. Never a mention of all this until the Dutton era. Anyway, so at a federal level, there's laws against it, and there's no way they're going to get power over both houses of parliament to change it. So that's not going to happen. But even if they did, there's state laws in place that they cannot override, because under our constitution, basically the state has power. The states have power to make laws, and it's only where specific powers have been granted to the federal government that they can make laws. And there's nothing in that list of specific powers that comes anywhere close to nuclear power generation as something that the federal government has power to do. That's why our electricity generation is all state-based, because there's no federal power to legislate in relation to it. And, on a really outside chance, you could argue, well, we've signed an international treaty. of some sort, and the federal government has power in relation to international treaties, but we haven't signed any treaty in relation to nuclear power, so they can't even use that. It's just, from a legal standpoint, completely impossible. As well as, Joe, they're proposing to use sites that are currently coal-fired power stations, and a lot of these are privately owned. So they would have to either buy them from these private operators, or if the operators refused,
to the private operator to run nuclear for them.
Yes, they would have to. They would have to, if the private operator refused to sell, they would have to forcibly buy it from them. Just so many issues from a legal point of view that it's so much wrong with this. It's crazy how every which way you look at this proposal, it's a dumb, stupid, impossible, crazy idea, which makes it all the more infuriating that such a large percentage of the population thinks it's quite possibly a good idea. We'll get to that in a moment with some polls, etc. Oh, yeah. So before we get to polls, how's the propaganda working out there? So, as you know, dear listener, on your behalf, I read the Courier Mail for my sins. And today's Courier Mail headline: Yes, in my backyard. Exclusive poll shows nuclear support. Regions back plan to replace their coal plants with reactors. And a picture of a couple of farmers basically saying, yep, put the nuclear power plant here, we want it. And then on page 4 today, headline: Nation is open to the nuclear option. And on page, it goes all the way over to page 5, where they've basically done a quick poll of 923 people and asked them whether they were happy to have a nuclear power plant in their backyard. And surprisingly, the people they surveyed, the majority of them said yes. And, so there's the sort of propaganda kick-off by the Murdoch press, all in favour of the nuclear power. And that's how that's sort of heading off. In terms of actual articles, so one of the...
I was just seeing the $60 billion to build the plants. Are you aware of Hinkley Point C?
No.
So, okay, in the UK, one of the big nuclear power stations is Hinkley Point.
Yes.
And EDF, who are probably one of the world's leading companies in terms of building power stations, are building the Hinkley Point C reactor for British Nuclear Fuels, I think it is.
Yeah.
It's 4 years, at least 4 years overdue. It's 50% over budget. And this is at an existing site that has the infrastructure already set up, with all the laws in place, by experts who know what they're doing.
Yeah. Well over time, well over budget. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I have heard of that one. It might be in the notes here somewhere. So, so one of the articles here, transfer of power skills set is ideal. This is one of the articles in today's Courier Mail. Coal-fired power station workers are a ready-made workforce. They could easily shift their skills across to new high-paying nuclear energy jobs. Experts say, Joe, I see those two words all the time in News Corp, and it invariably means
some bloke down the pub.
Some guy with a degree who has sold out on his profession, which is only marginally related to the topic at hand, has come out in the same way that you can find some medical people came out as anti-vaxxers,
You can find geologists, the young Earth creationists.
Indeed. So experts say is immediately my ears prick up. Experts say Australia should also tap into the growing pipeline of skilled specialists for the AUKUS nuclear submarine program and train them for a local industry. And he says here, Centre for Radiation Research, Education and Innovation Director Tony Hooker said the co-location would not only lower energy transmission costs but provide a ready-made workforce with transferable skills. Quote, the advantage is that all of your electrical engineers, mechanical engineers, all of your trades and ancillary staff would just likely transition across to a nuclear power plant, Professor Hooker said. Professor Tony Hooker. So I immediately Googled, who the fuck is Professor Tony Hooker? And he's got a PhD in molecular biology genetics with research interests in the mechanisms of radiation-induced damage. He's the inaugural director of the Centre for Radiation Research, Education and Innovation at the University of Adelaide. As the principal radiation advisor, radiation health for the South Australian government. It's all to do with biology, genetics and radiation.
Yeah, radiation damage and radiation cures, radiation treatment.
Guess what? That doesn't make you an expert on whether a power station in the regions is a good idea, whether jobs are transferable, whether it's... And the Courier Mail kicks off with experts say. He's not a friggin' expert of what skilled specialists can transfer their skills.
If you were going to ask him about what the risk of nuclear exposure to humans in the surrounding area, absolutely he's an expert.
Yes. Yes, exactly. And there was another article in the Courier Mail, scare campaign embarrassing, say experts. And this was about how I think a number of Labor MPs or others were sort of doing memes with talking about sort of mutations of people and animals that might happen in and around nuclear power plants. And further on in that article, University of Sydney electrical engineering senior lecturer Dr. Jeremy Quee said he was supportive of the coalition's nuclear plan. He pushed back on claims nuclear was too expensive by clarifying that although it is much higher capital costs in the short term, the production of energy is more affordable than renewable energy. Comparing nuclear to renewable, it is very stable and its cost is very low. In terms of the running costs, it's lower than coal and natural gas. But when we talk about capital cost investment, that will be much higher over the short term. So...
But again, he says it's lower cost than coal and natural gas, but not necessarily renewables. Guess what's cheap? Sunlight and wind.
Exactly. And who is he? He's currently a senior lecturer in electrical engineering. That doesn't make you an expert on energy costs.
No.
Just because you've got a degree in something electrical doesn't make you an expert in this field. Just because you've got a specialty in radiation damage doesn't make you an expert in the economics of putting nuclear power stations in the regions. But we get these Courier Mail articles that have experts say, and these guys sell their souls for a few lines of propaganda, for God's sake. But, Joe, Sydney Morning Herald, Peter Fitzsimmons, excellent article, which should be compulsory reading for every person in Australia. And so he has interviewed Professor Ty Christopher, an electrical engineer with 4 decades of experience in the power industry and is the director of Energy Futures Network within the Faculty of Engineering at the University of Wollongong. And so the interview starts and Fitzsimons says to this guy, well, what's your credentials? And he says, I'm now just shy of 40 years in the power industry, including 10 years on the executive of what is now Endeavour Energy, with the last 5 years as the chief engineer. I'm now with the University of Wollongong, helping coordinate energy futures research, and I lead a collaboration of just under 100 academics from all disciplines across the university, social scientists, market economists, marine ecologists and engineers, all of varying backgrounds, to bring together those minds in a focused way on energy systems. And there was somewhere else there where he talked about billions of dollars of stuff that he'd been involved in. Let me see if I might get to it soon. So,
here we go. I say this from the point of view of being an engineer who's delivered literally billions of dollars worth of energy projects throughout my life.
Thank you.
Even 20 years to build a power station is very optimistic.
Thank you. So that's now this is somebody with some credentials that we can listen to. And he was the one who talked about the offshore turbines that I mentioned earlier, about the size of them and the sort of equivalent of what a large wind turbine can produce compared to 5 homes, etc. So now he's talked about the capacity of offshore wind and how it's relatively high compared to solar and onshore wind. Its capacity is around 50 to 55%. So that's when it's sort of functioning and generating power, compared to onshore, which is about 30%. And he's saying that in Australia it makes even more sense because as a population we mostly cling to the coast. So you can put them offshore near where the energy is needed. So it's much shorter and less expensive transmission lines. So he says, Fitzsimons says 55% sort of capacity still sounds a bit low compared to, say, nuclear, which is surely 100%. And he said, well, and coal. And he says, well, the capacity factor of coal at the moment is 60%. So there's a lot of downtime in electricity generation for our coal-fired generators.
Especially when they blow up.
Yes. And the bulk of Australia's coal-fired power plants will exit the grid within 10 years. Their energy has to be replaced, not in 20 to 30 years' time, but within the next decade. And even, International Atomic Energy Agency publishes a guidelines handbook, step-by-step guide on how to go nuclear, internationally recognised manual on what you have to do to go from zero to a functioning nuclear power plant, and it's at least 15 to 20 years. So our existing coal generators are going within 10. Nuclear would be at least 15 to 20. We need something in between. And what else did he say here? He says, when people ask me, am I anti-nuclear, I look them in the eye and say, no, I'm anti-bullshit. That's a guy I can relate to. He says, renewables are the cheapest. They are reliable enough for what we need. They are the best way to bring down customer bills, and they are the best way for us to decarbonise our economy, which is what we are committed to do. Joe, we need to decarbonise, and the solution is cheaper and it's decentralised, and these fuckwits in the Conservative cause just want to make it harder and harder to get to the right decision.
Yeah. It's like the scare stories about electric vehicles. The stuff I'm seeing about them, and it's bullshit.
Yeah.
And it's relatively easily debunked, but, you know, you put your news headline out, nobody reads past the headline.
Yeah. And this is the problem with the ABC, when it just issues a headline, you know, Dutton says this, blah, 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 Albanese asked to respond. People think, oh, well, it must be a reasonable proposition Must be a 50-50 moment. Must be some credibility to it.
So you're saying the headline should say Dutton talks out of his arse again?
Yeah. In an ideal world, Joe, yes. So
Dutton spews irrational nonsense. Albanese refuses to answer.
yeah. Ted O'Brien, Joe. This guy reminds me of Morrison. He's got the same smirk happening. He's got the same mannerisms. So he's the opposition energy spokesman. And, they've got this nuclear plan. You would think one of the basics of the plan, Joe, would be, well, how much of our needs is going to be covered by nuclear under your plan?
Mm-hmm.
Roughly, ballpark figure, what percentage of our electricity needs are going to be met by these 7 power stations? Because they haven't even said whether they're proper power stations or they're the small modular ones that don't exist.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just the basics of, okay, you're going to go nuclear. How much can we expect from nuclear? Now, insiders, Spears is the guy the compere. Normally he's terrible, but on this occasion, maybe he's better than that. So let's go with a bit of David Spears on this one.
Will it be 10%?
And so, again, our energy mix we'll talk about in the future, ahead of the next election.
This is what the market needs to know now. I mean, if it's only going to be a tiny fraction of the market...
They won't have long to wait, David, until they understand the energy mix.
Look, they need to know very soon, well, right now, really, whether they should keep investing or not. And what matters is whether nuclear is going to make up 20, 50% of the energy mix or 2 or 3% of the energy mix.
So a couple of things. Firstly, I'm a Liberal and I appreciate and respect that investors want to make money. And so we have designed this policy with a crystal clear vision of Australians paying for cheaper, cleaner and
they'll only
consistent
do that
24/7
They'll only do that if the market keeps investing, as you've acknowledged at the outset.
And I think I've answered that, acknowledging the need. But
they'll only invest if you give them some clarity on whether nuclear is going to take up 50% or 2% of the mix.
They will get clarity. And
do you know this answer?
In terms of the broader energy mix, David, we will be coming out with that in due course.
But do you know yourself, or will you leave this to another body to work that out? You mentioned earlier this body that will work out how many reactors will go on each plant site. That suggests you haven't worked this out.
So we have done our planning and we'll be very explicit about our assumptions.
Do you know?
But about our assumptions.
Do you know the answer to this question?
Rephrase the question. Is it specific gigawatts?
How much of the energy mix will be nuclear under your plan?
We will be announcing that at the time that we announce our broader mix. Because, David...
But do you know it at the moment? Do you know it at the moment? Or would this be for an independent body to work out?
We've announced the nuclear part of our policy. The real question is not on nuclear, for example, how much it costs, but is it value for money?
I think a lot of people worry about how much it costs and whether it's going to be pushing their bills up.
But it's from a
coming back to this question, because I just want to be clear on this.
Go ahead.
You're not sure at the moment whether nuclear would make up only 5% of the energy mix?
David, we've done all the work on the nuclear front, but
do you know this?
But until we release renewables policy and gas policy.
Depressing, Joe. Fools like that.
Well, of course he knows the answer. The answer is 0%. They've no intention of delivering nuclear.
They've no intention of delivering it.
No.
But even if you said to him, in a fanciful world where these 7 nuclear reactors are built, because they haven't even said whether they're proper reactors or whether they're the small modular ones that don't even exist yet. He's got no idea. It just demonstrates how full of shit these guys are that he couldn't give a ballpark figure of what they're going to generate from this. And it just had a Morrison-type smirk about him. For goodness me.
They're schooled in not answering the question, aren't they?
But it's obvious to anybody watching it. Like, surely nobody fools for that anymore. It's clear to everybody he doesn't know.
No, I'm sure he does.
Or the answer is so low he doesn't want to say.
Exactly.
Each one is, which one do you reckon it'd be, Joe? I reckon he doesn't even know.
No, I reckon they know, and the answer is 0%. This is a distraction. They have no intention of delivering on it.
Joe.
I reckon they'll have submit reports that are generated by some very expensive contractors, some consultants who'll go out and go, actually, nuclear is going to be too expensive, but it'll take them several years to get to that point.
Yeah.
By which time, we'll have kicked the coal industry down the road for another however many years and carried on digging up shit out of the ground that should be staying in the ground.
Yeah.
And it will have fulfilled its purpose.
John says the smirk reminds me of the Dunning-Kruger theory. Look, the smirk reminded me of Morrison.
I was
John?
reading about Dunning-Kruger today. It's a statistical screw-up. But
Right.
anyway,
Yeah. What do you mean it's a statistical screw-up?
it doesn't exist. They've
Dunning-Kruger.
actually gone back and reanalyzed the statistics from
What
the
was-
paper.
What did the paper say?
The paper said basically people who are less capable overestimate their ability.
Yes.
And basically the way they figured this out was by correlating two numbers, but one of the numbers was actually generated from the other number. And so it was correlated with itself.
Okay. So it wasn't okay, and so it's not a replicatable
Basically.
study.
Yeah.
There's so much in Thinking Fast and Slow that was not replicatable as well. Like, a lot of these things are questionable. So Dunning-Kruger theory doesn't stack up based on that.
Yeah.
Well, the evidence they relied on is flawed.
Didn't show that.
Interesting.
Yes.
Yeah. Look, there is a solution, Joe, to this power issue. Mm-hmm. Well, maybe not a solution, but some help. The Lucas Heights facility, which is the one which actually Watley was corresponding about. He had some connection with it at one point. And so this is the facility that sort of has a very low level sort of nuclear facility that generates stuff for medical purposes and for scientific research, like extremely, extremely low output for these sort of minor medical interests of sorts.
Yeah,
And-
it basically allows us to become self-sufficient in nuclear medicine.
Yes. Anyway, that the politician who was kicked off from the Liberals, I think, and then stood as an independent, Di Lee. I don't know how you pronounce her name.
Okay.
She's talking about that facility. We'll play this one.
My understanding also is that our Lucas Heights, where our nuclear reactor, my understanding is from speaking in this space, is that it generates so much energy, but that energy is actually not being utilized. It's just, it's not being captured. So that's another, perhaps in discussing nuclear energy, we can look at Lucas Heights to see what's happening there.
There we go. A secret eighth facility is possible, Joe.
Lucas Heights was never designed to generate electricity. It was designed for a completely different purpose.
You're such a pessimist, Joe. Think expansively. Think outside the box. Get in touch with your community,
Uh-huh.
and start sentences with, it's my understanding that, which is what you do in the law a lot when you basically, I don't really know, but here's my best guess.
But the laws of physics, just obey whatever a lawmaker says.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I was in the elevator, Joe, and there was a guy there I met, Mark, who I've talked to before, and I know he's a conservative bent, and he said, how's your website going? I said, well, my podcast is going fine. In fact, tonight I'm going to be talking about Peter Dutton and his crazy nuclear policy, and I'll be bagging it severely. And he mentioned about the sort of mutation memes and stuff. And I said, I'm not worried about that. It's the cost. It's incredibly expensive. And he said, well, it's cheaper in France, actually. It's cheap in France, but, maybe they've been doing it for a long time. These are the sorts of things you've got to deal with all the time. Quick Google search. Dutton apparently said France is the cheapest power in Europe, with 70% of its electricity generated from nuclear energy. But, and again from another article in the Sydney Morning Herald, the Sydney Morning Herald seems to at least be publishing stuff anti-nuclear that I don't see in the Murdoch press, Joe. Not sure why or what's going on there, but at least a couple of decent things have come from the Sydney Morning Herald. Anyway, in this article it says, last month, France's spot electricity price went negative as cheap renewable energy flooded its power market. Combined with reduced demand over a weekend, French officials shut down 3 nuclear reactors because their power could not compete against ultra-cheap renewables. Other parts of Europe are also turning off their nuclear reactors for periods of time because their power is expensive compared to renewables. Joe, I didn't know it was possible to shut down a nuclear facility, but it is?
Yeah, I mean, you don't shut it down, you turn down the amount of energy you produce. They're always going to be ticking over. But yes, basically when you split an atom, it produces a number of neutrons that fire off into and split other atoms. And if you stick in control rods, they absorb the neutrons and they reduce the amount of atoms that are being split. And so you can reduce the amount of energy that you are generating.
So there you go, dear listener. If you are in an elevator with somebody and strike up a conversation and they mention the French experience, you are now fully armed. Oh, and one extra bit for you. You can say France, despite its long experience building nuclear power plants, has struggled to meet cost and time targets. The 1,650 megawatt Flamanville 3 power plant on the Cherbourg Peninsula in northwest France completed fuel loading last month and is due to be fully operational by year's end. Construction started in 2007. Joe, that's a long time ago, Joe.
That's the one that literally sitting on mum and dad's chimney stack I could see when I was growing up.
There you go. Well, this is Flamanville 3
Yeah, this
power
is
plant.
the third one. Yeah.
Yeah. So
And then just up the coast is Cap de la Hague, which is the nuclear reprocessing plant.
Yep. And you're perfectly fine, Joe, despite growing up. Yep. And you are.
So when I was, I don't know, early teens, they opened up a power line to France. We got more reliable electricity because the local power station used to drop out for hours at a time.
Yes.
And it was cheaper. And the local press ran a April Fool's article that said you could tell when we were switching over to French electricity, there'd be a warning light and we'd have French sockets next to the English sockets on the wall, and you'd have to unplug everything out of the English sockets and plug them into the French sockets. And you'd know that you were running on French electricity because it would smell faintly of garlic. And people honestly believed it, wrote in complaint letters.
Anyway, there's the third power plant. Construction started in 2007.
Yep.
And they've only just completed fuel loading.
Yeah.
It's nearly 20 years later. And it was...
This is 100 miles from the 500 megawatt offshore wind plant that they've just built in 3 years.
There you go. This one is going to take close to 20, and it was initially supposed to take 5. It was supposed to be up and running by 2012 at a cost of $3.3 billion. Brackets 5.3 billion. That would be 5.3 billion in today's money, I think.
No, 3.3 billion euros.
Euros. $5.3 billion
Dollars.
Yep. 12 years behind schedule, the estimated cost is now 20 billion euros. So
7 times.
initially, a 5-year build is blown out to nearly 20. Initial cost, 3.3 billion euros, now 20 billion. And this is in a country with long experience of building nuclear power plants.
There's a reason that the French are building wind farms.
Yes.
Because it's cheap. Because
Yes.
it works.
They've got wind.
Yeah.
The other thing you'll see, some other people I speak to about this, life's getting hard, dear listener, when I just speak to people. And, you say, well, you realise, of course, the levelised cost of energy looks at the amortisation of the capital costs and is a fair way of working out the true cost of the various systems. And, you'll say the CSIRO has done a report and somebody will go, well, you can't trust them. Bunch of scientists, they're all in the pay of the government. Of course, they're going to tell the government whatever it wants. And you just go, oh, okay. Well, you've also got the international finance services firm Lazard has been doing this for a long time as well. And I know in previous episodes we've looked at their reports and it's the same story. And it's all over the world. Onshore wind, the cheapest. Utility-sized solar, next cheapest. Nuclear, the most expensive. And in terms of trends, wind and solar getting cheaper, nuclear getting more expensive. That's the sort of stuff that is going on.
Interestingly, although solar isn't effective for large periods of the day, it is effective at the time that we actually use the most energy, which is when we're running air conditioning.
True.
Which is in the middle of the day.
Yep.
To the point where when I was out at a coal-fired power station back in 2018, I think, they said when the power plant was built, their don't touch anything period was in the middle of the day. They were running peak capacity, and because power generation is based on the difference between the heat in the generator and the heat outside, so basically trying to shed the heat outside to cool the water down to reheat it, they actually run at less capacity in the middle of the day. So they're less efficient in the middle of the day because of the heat outside.
That makes sense.
So that was their peak, don't do anything, don't do any work. It's now their maintenance period because there's so much rooftop solar that the demand for coal-fired generation in the middle of the day has dropped down to nearly nothing.
Yes.
At least for this plant.
Yes. Actually, I should do with levelised cost of energy. Where have I put that in these notes? I did have it here somewhere. It's gone missing. Doesn't matter. Let me just, Joe, share the screen here with a bit of luck. Am I going to share the screen? Share screen. Not yet. Let me just try and add a screen share to this. Essential report. There we go. Essential report has asked people their views on nuclear power, and it's a bit depressing. This is from the 18th of June. Views on emission targets by voting intention. Oh dear. Which of the following is closer to your view on Australia's 2030-2050 emissions targets? And the blue one is Australia should stick to the 2030 target, and achieving this target is necessary to meet the 2050. Or the red one, which is Australia should abandon the 2030 target because it's unachievable, it's hurting the economy, and instead we should focus on the 2050 target, which is basically 2030 is too hard. We should kick this can down the road.
Did you ever see the report where it said basically the earlier we start moving towards net zero, the less pain we have.
Yeah,
The
funny
later
that.
we leave it, the more effort we have to put in.
Yeah. Overall, 52% of Australians said we should stick to the 2030. 48% of Australians said, let's forget 2030. It's too hard. It's hurting too much. Let's just kick that can down the road.
Do they have any evidence that it's actually hurting too much? That it's had any impact whatsoever on the economy?
I doubt it. Gender, of course, males more likely to kick the can down the road than females. Age, old people, 55 plus.
You aren't going to live to see the problem.
Correct. More than happy to kick that can down the road. It's the young people. 63% of 18 to 34-year-olds want to stick to the 2030 target. Only 41% of 55-year-olds want to. They're such a selfish bunch, these old codgers, with no concern for...
Well, they've proved that with house prices, haven't they?
with everything. Voting intention, of course, Labor and the Greens more likely to stick to the 2030 target. Coalition and minor parties, which usually means Pauline Hanson and Katter and people like that.
No, minor as in M-I-N-E-R parties.
Yes. It gets me is 27% of Greens voters want to kick the can down the road.
Yeah.
What's the Greens? I mean, obviously you could consider nuclear as a green option, but it's an economically stupid option.
Yeah.
Maybe that's what they're thinking. Nuclear's green. Let's go the nuclear option
Oh,
without
it's
knowing the
interesting
economics.
that the Greens parties, Greenpeace, for instance, were against the expansion of nuclear. The Greens have historically been, not necessarily in this country, but Greens around the world have historically been against nuclear.
Yes. Yep. Which of the following do you think is the better way for Australia to achieve its emissions target of net zero by 2050? The blue is continue to develop renewables and decommission fossil fuels. The red is stop the development of renewables, stick with fossil fuels, and wait till nuclear is developed and can kick in 15 to 20 years.
In what world is stick with fossil fuels the right answer? Renewables are available and cheap, even if you want to go for nuclear.
I know. Joe, 51% of coalition voters think that is the best option. Stop renewables, stick with fossil, wait for nuclear. Same with the minor parties. Joe, 26% of Greens voters think that's a good idea.
That's the scary part.
27% of Labor. Once again, let's look at gender. Gosh, wonder what this will reveal. Oh, actually, very
difference.
similar.
Yeah. That's
Interesting. So,
I would say within statistical noise, actually.
yes, matches the exactly 62% of males, 63% of females want to continue renewables. 38% don't. What was the overall figure? I should have had that. The overall figure, 63% of Australians, let's go with renewables. 37% say, let's stop renewables, keep going with fossil fuels, wait for nuclear.
And I bet with age, it's very much skewed towards the older one.
Age,
Oh,
not as strong as I would have thought.
No,
Age,
it's the 35 to 54 that are the most keen on. Oh, sorry, no. Renewables is.
yeah. Funnily, the 35 to 54 are more keen on the develop renewables and get rid of fossils than the younger 18 to 34. Still, the 55 plus are the strongest group, but not by so much as I would have thought
No.
comparatively. voting intention, kind of what you'd expect. Sometimes the way these things are phrased can make a difference. We've already done the 2030 target. I won't do that one again. Quickly, views on Israel. Overall. Which is your view on Israel's military action in Gaza? The blue is Israel is justified. The orange is Israel should agree to a temporary ceasefire, and the red is Israel should permanently withdraw. The grey is unsure. So 15% of Australians overall think Israel is justified in continuing its military action. The rest think there should be either a temporary or permanent withdrawal, or they don't know. So only 15% think Israel is justified. That's the overall trend. Gender. Males, 20% think Israel is justified. Only 10% of females think so.
I think it's the unsure that shows the biggest gender variation.
Yes. And in the unsure, 34% of females are unsure. 19% of males are sure. Age, the older you are, the more, 18 to 34 and 35 to 54, only 11% think Israel is justified. But when you get to the boomers, 55 plus, 22% think Israel is justified. So that's Australians' current thinking of that, and the rest I don't think we'll worry about those. I think we'll just move on from that. So, Joe, where are we up to? 9:13. I thought it would just be about nuclear, this one. Could I find that levelized cost of energy report? I can't, but it's clear, dear listener, renewables are the cheaper option. When you look at the capital costs and the depreciation over the lifetime of the capital and the decommissioning and the running costs, the renewables are considerably cheaper than nuclear. It's a no-brainer. And all the other arguments don't really matter because you can bring it online quickly. You don't have to wait 20 years. It's not going to be fraught with the same difficulties that nuclear has. And Joe, just a decentralised system, like they worry about China attacking us. Well, 7 well-placed bombs on nuclear facilities would wipe out, under the coalition plan, a fair bit of our power generation. But when you've got multiple facilities scattered all over the country, it really provides comfort in the sense that you're spreading the risk amongst all these minor facilities. So in the event of disasters, you don't have all your eggs in one basket or all your eggs in 7 baskets. There's so many arguments for this. But it's a measure, Joe, of where we are in this community. That's the most obvious, simple solution is somehow up for grabs for discussion. I'm depressed.
And yet you ask the average, I would say even the Conservative voters, would you put rooftop solar on? And they would absolutely.
Yes.
It would be interesting to ask that question, actually. All these people who are going, oh no, we should keep fossil fuels, is to ask them, do you have rooftop solar?
Yeah.
Because I bet they do. I bet the majority of them do.
Yeah. It's so tribal. It's our tribe has decided nuclear. If it was Labor pushing nuclear and Liberals pushing multiple privately owned renewable facilities all over the country that were cheaper, these same people would be jumping across to the other side of the argument. It's pathetic, Joe. It's depressing. How would anybody get into politics when good, solid arguments backed by facts are just worth nothing. I think this is our media
I think
again.
It's interesting with the whole you can't trust the CSIRO would be to ask, well, who would you trust?
It was, yeah, let's say none of them.
Right. So how would they know?
Yeah. Well, you don't know. They're all the same. You can't trust any of them, they then say. Well, that's enough of a rant, Joe. We've got an hour 20, hour 17 on.
I think we've sent all the listeners to sleep.
Yeah, we have. Anyone still there?
2 people.
John says, my ardent right-wing FW climate-denying man put solar on his roof. There we go. And he says, the positive twist on those polls is that the Libs are getting more popular in Libs seats, only their base. Yeah, they're not appealing to the inner city suburbs, inner city electorates at all. Yeah. Right. Okay. Thanks in the chat room for watching. Next week, a grab bag of different topics. We'll talk to you then. Bye for now. Joe, are you going to give me it's a good night from him?
And it's a good night from him.